Oh, that guy's got great rap. He's a fine conversationalist. Oh, that's the kind of guy that can talk to anyone. Have you ever been referred to as any of these things? Well, they're very positive attributes. Being able to go into a social event and work the room with ease with the confidence that you can strike up and hold a conversation with anyone is a great skill set to have. A gal named Stephanie Vosa wrote a nice article for Fast Company highlighting the 6 things that she feels like fine conversationalists have. And I'm going to go through and highlight those 6 and touch on a little different spin that I have on some of them and interject some of my own ideas. But it's a great list just to start, so I wanted to go through them with you. The first thing is you want to always be sure that you're listening more than you're talking. And this is kind of counterintuitive because you think of a great conversationalist, someone who can spin the prose in a great, interesting way to draw people in and suck in the crowd and captivate people like a magician on stage. But really, when you express genuine interest and you're listening to the other person, it is much more appealing and much more engaging, as strange as that may sound, to the other person. There's the story that I've talked about before where there's 2 political candidates and one gal who was interviewing for a newspaper sat down with both of them on consecutive nights to have dinner. And they said, well, what did you think about the first candidate? I'm not sure who his name was. I think this is a real story. But she said, at the end of the dinner, I was convinced that he was the most interesting person in the world. And then after the second dinner, they said, well, what do you think about candidate 2? And she said, by the end of the dinner, I was convinced that I was the most interesting person in the world. And clearly the second one was the one that she favored, or so she said in her article. And it's very, like I said, kind of counterintuitive. Keep that in mind. You don't always need to be driving. And if you're not able to listen more than you talk, let's say the other person just isn't contributing that much, well, at least try to push the conversation back to them, asking questions to then drawing them out intentionally, as opposed to saying, well, they're not saying much, so I'm just going to ramble and ramble and ramble. Because that's not interesting even to someone who is kind of shy and in their head at that moment. The goal is to express and then try to draw them out of their own kind of head. Another little side note on that I have is you want to be sure that when you are listening, you give them your full attention and are present, because a lot of people will try to use this and they'll just stand there and their eyes will be kind of glazed over and they'll kind of look disinterested. They don't realize the subcommunication is coming across. The other person can tell that even though they're not talking, they're not truly interested in what they're saying. So that's not a positive. So be sure that you're present and are showing interest in what they have to say. And the last thing is, don't be thinking about what you're going to respond when they're talking. It's a natural human tendency to want to say something cool or something that builds rapport or something that relates to them after they talk. But if you can just tell your brain, no, just listen, understand everything, be empathetic, put yourself in their shoes, be really entranced in what the person is saying, even if at the end of the sentence, I've practiced this so many times because it's not natural to me. I naturally want to say something cool after someone says something. And after some sentences, you really won't have anything to say because you won't have been thinking about what you were planning and have lined up to say. You were thinking about what they were saying. But even when you don't, that's actually very engaging to them. You don't look like a dope that doesn't have something to say. You look like you were very interested in what they were saying, and that's cool and that's endearing from them. If you watch some of the great communicators, the most charismatic people in interviews and things, a lot of times where most people would have something right to jump on to say, they don't, and they just kind of smile and nod or understand and can kind of show they're thinking it through. This is a powerful little twist on that. And the last thing that helps, and this is kind of hard, you don't want to try to feign this, but if you really are an interested person, some people are just more interested in the world and are always asking questions. If you're that kind of person that truly is interested in the other person, or you can find something about them or some experience that they've had that you are interested in, we'll target that because sincerity and interest is going to shine through. Number 2, great conversationalists do not always interject their own experiences. I have a video that I'll show at the bottom of this. You can click on the link that talks about how you don't always want to jump in immediately and contribute your similar experiences that you think will draw you two closer. It's once again counterintuitive. Naturally, if someone went to Australia and you studied there, for instance, I studied abroad there. Oh, I actually studied abroad right there a little bit south of Sydney and Newcastle. You want to do that, but that's not always the best thing to do because it just kind of, in their mind, even though you're trying to contribute, it shows you're either reaching hard for rapport or just taking the conversation back to you. You know, your story is more important. Even though you don't mean that, you're just excited to contribute. It doesn't come across that well. So a lot of times the best way to do this, well, the clear best way to do this is to let them tell their story, and then 80% of the time you can steer the conversation into a way that they'll ask you a question about that. Oh, you ever been to Australia? You say, yeah, as a matter of fact, I actually studied in Newcastle, just a little bit south of Sydney. It was great. I had a lot of the same experience you did. What did you think of Darling Harbour? Or what did you think of the Star City Casino? And then it's cool because you showed a level of social status and confidence that you didn't have to jump on that first commonality you had. If it came out, cool, like it did, but if not, you're not crushed at home sitting later in that conversation later that day thinking, oh, I wish I could have told them I studied in Australia. They would have thought I was so cool. It's not that important. The flow of the conversation, the energy of the conversation is much more important, so keep that in mind. The third thing that great conversationalists do is they're quick to admit that they don't know something. So it's very unflattering of people when they're know-it-alls, even if they do know the question, or even worse off, let's say they're 60% sure that something's right, and they tell you in a very confident way just to kind of see if they can pull one over on you and they're not exactly sure. If you know they're not right and they're pulling that on you, oh, it just looks terrible. It makes you think so poorly of the person. It happens to me all the time. I can think of a few people right now that do that, and it's just a terrible characteristic. There's no upside to it. So what you want to do instead is, even if you are confident, let's say you're 70% confident in an answer. Someone asks you a question about LASIK eye surgery. As opposed to saying, I had it 2 years ago and this was the way it was. Why not soften it? Use a bit of humility, kind of back up from it and say, I actually did a little research when I had the procedure myself done 2 years ago, and this is the technology used. Now, technology's changing a lot, so it could be a little different from then, but that was what I found out a couple years ago. Or even if you're 100% sure, as opposed to saying, yeah, it's like this is the way they did it. A little humility once again, just to soften, just to keep the conversation a little more flowing. Just say, I actually had the procedure done 2 years ago, and I did some research, and this was the way it was. And I would assume it's pretty similar. I'm not sure, but go ahead. Even if you are sure, just by wording it that way, it's just it comes across a little bit better. It's less aggressive, it's less in your face, and it's more humble, and people really appreciate that. All right, the fourth thing that she says great conversationalists do or are is very well read. And this is the one thing that I thought was a little too specific. I'm sure that could be true, but I find that great conversationalists just have a breadth of knowledge and interest that come from not only reading, but from traveling and having a broad set of interests, or maybe a very interesting upbringing, or they have some interesting experiences in their lives. So reading is good. Obviously, it's the quickest way to get a whole host of knowledge that you otherwise wouldn't have. But traveling and other kinds of experiences are great because when you can relate to someone who has that same experience or that same travel, hit that same travel destination as you, it has a lot more. It has a lot more closeness than just sharing an idea that you two may have read, one in a newspaper, one in a book 10 years ago. By once again, like the Australia example, you say, oh, I was there too. We went to the same places in another country. It's cool. So I would say you want to have a breadth of interests and experiences. Number 5 is they look for cues in the conversation. And this is very important. So great conversationalists know when a conversation's over. There's never going to be a time when the person they're talking to in their head is thinking, oh, I wish I could get out of this conversation. This Barron guy is just so boring. Looking at your watch and stepping back and, looking away a little bit, checking your drink and looking at other people and things like that. Any cue, the exiting cue in my mind is the most important, even more than people being uncomfortable in conversation, which is also important. But anytime anyone shows any inkling that they want to leave the conversation, you're gone. They can always come back over if you misread that and want to talk to you more. You say, oh yeah, hey, great talking to you, and you leave. There's a million things you can say, but never keep someone around when they want to leave the conversation. But other cues they talk about, or I'm guessing that she was referring to, is discomfort in a conversation. Maybe I'm talking to someone, I'm a little too close, and I see their body language. I take a quarter of an inch step to the side. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to step back. If there's someone behind me, I'm going to orient myself to the side, which feels a lot less intense. You can probably just tell as I turn right here and I'm talking to you now, it's a lot less intense than when I'm standing even further back, but looking straight at you, squared up. So all these different things. They read social cues good to put the other person at ease and to keep the conversation going. And the 6th thing that good conversationalists do is they let go of the details. And I think this is actually kind of a nice way that she says, people really aren't that interested in all of the details. So good conversationists will tell the interesting parts of the story. And I'm actually going to put out a video here, hopefully within a couple months, talking about how to tell a good story. But just kind of a broad swipe about it, what she was talking about, don't worry about the details. People weren't necessarily that interested how many nights you stayed in Madagascar and then how many nights you went to the next place. More importantly, what was a cool experience there? What had you never seen? How did that feel? So the details about dry empirical data that don't have any energy or emotion behind them, leave those behind. Because even if people are feigning interest, that's not interesting. Imagine they were telling you the same thing about their trip. You don't care how many nights they stayed at a hotel, right? But if they saw some fire walk with a bunch of monks walking around on fire and coals in a trance, I don't know if that's real or not, but if they did, that would be cool, right? So that's something you want to hear. So be sure there's emotion and whatnot behind it. All right, to summarize, the 6 things that great conversationalists do. Well, number 1, they definitely listen more than they talk. And if the other person isn't talking much, well, they're talking and trying to draw the other person out to get them more engaged, to contribute more. Number 2, they don't always interject their experiences. If it comes up in question, the other person asks them, it's even stronger than if you jump on that right away and share, and to them seem like you're taking the spotlight. They admit what they don't know, and even if they do know, maybe they soften it with a little humility. They're well-read, and I believe they're well-traveled and have a breadth of experience and interest. They look for social cues to be sure that the person in the conversation is comfortable and always engaged. And lastly, they let go of the details and only talk about aspects of the story that have an emotional attachment to them, because we know that that's very interesting. If I could encourage you to try 2 of these, I would say listen more than you talk. Be sure of that. And like I said, don't be thinking of a response while they're talking. Just let your head go completely blank. At the end, you'll have something to say. And if you don't, just comment on it. Oh, that's crazy. I was thinking about what you said about being in Mogadishu, and it was how you were there and you had to buy a pair of shoes. You had 1 shoe for a portion of that walk. It was crazy. That's fine. Just rehash what they said. Number 2, don't interject your experiences. That's something that can be hard to do because we naturally want to jump on because we feel like we're creating that rapport and we're showing similarities, but don't. Back off. And if they don't ask a question about it, you can kind of work the conversation back to encourage them to ask you a question and then bring it up then. It's a much more smooth, a much more confident, much more high status way to do things. Try these out. Let me know in the comments below how they work, or shoot me a private message, and I'll talk to you soon.